This story belongs to those who remember when a handshake meant something, when hard work spoke louder than words, and when folks judged character by what a person did, not what they looked like or sounded like. It's about Anna Miller, a woman whose world lived in silence, and Jack Holden, a man whose war memories taught him to see past surface troubles to the heart beneath. Set in the summer of 1882, in a time when communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone's business. This tale reminds us that sometimes the most profound conversations happen without a single word being spoken. It's a story about dignity, maintained in the face of rejection, about partnerships built on respect rather than pity, and about how the courage to do what's right can change not just two lives, but an entire town's understanding of what it means to be neighborly. The stage wheels ground against loose stones as they rolled to a stop outside Millerville's depot. Anna Miller's fingers worried the brass clasps of her worn traveling bag while dust settled around the coach like flour through a sifter. Through the small window, she watched other passengers gathering their belongings, a traveling salesman counting his sample cases, an elderly woman clutching a birdcage close to her chest, a young mother bouncing a fretful infant against her shoulder. Anna waited, always waited. Let the others climb down first. Avoid the rush and bumping shoulders, the confused looks when people realized she couldn't hear their polite excuses or hurried apologies. The stage driver's weathered face appeared at the door, his mouth moving in what was likely an offer to help with her bag. Anna shook her head and stepped down carefully, her black button-up boots finding purchase on the wooden platform. The driver touched his hat brim and turned away, already forgetting her as he began unloading freight from the coach's rear boot. Main Street stretched before her like a gauntlet she'd run a dozen times before in other towns. False-fronted buildings lined both sides: general store, hardware shop, bakery, hotel. Painted signs swayed in the morning breeze she couldn't hear, creaking on their chains like old bones. People moved along the wooden sidewalks with purpose, their conversations lost to her, their laughter silent as pantomime. Anna smoothed her faded calico dress and checked that her hair remained properly pinned beneath her small bonnet. The fabric showed careful mending at the sleeves, and she'd spent her last good button replacing one that had fallen loose during the journey. First impressions mattered, especially when you couldn't rely on words to explain yourself or smooth over misunderstandings. The general store seemed the most promising place to start. A bell above the door probably announced her entry. She could see it swinging on its mount, and the store owner looked up from his ledger book. He was a thin man with wire spectacles perched on his nose, ink stains darkening his fingertips like permanent shadows. His eyes took in her appearance with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to sizing up customers, the careful mending on her sleeves, the worn but spotlessly clean traveling dress, the nervous way she approached his counter while clutching a small cloth purse. Anna pulled a piece of brown paper from her handbag and began writing with the stub of a pencil worn down to barely 2 inches. "Good morning, sir. I am seeking employment. Kitchen work, cleaning, laundry. I have references available." The man's expression shifted as he read, curiosity giving way to uncomfortable recognition. His gaze flicked to her face, then away again like he'd looked at something he shouldn't have seen. He shook his head before she'd finished writing, already reaching for a bolt of fabric to keep his hands busy and his eyes occupied. "Sorry, miss, nothing available here." She couldn't read his lips clearly from this angle, but his body language spoke louder than shouted words. Shoulders turned away, eyes avoiding contact, hands busying themselves with unnecessary tasks. The universal stance of polite dismissal. Anna folded the paper with practiced precision and nodded her thanks. Outside, the morning sun felt warmer on her face, but something cold had settled in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. The hardware store proved no different. The owner, a burly man with sleeves rolled up past his elbows, took one look at her written request and shook his head so vigorously his thick mustache bounced. "Got all the help I need," he mouthed with exaggerated clarity, as if speaking louder would somehow reach her through the wall of silence. Then he turned his attention to arranging hammers on a wall display, their wooden handles worn smooth by countless hands. At the bakery, the woman behind the counter didn't even let Anna finish writing. She saw the paper and pencil, noticed the way Anna watched faces instead of listening for voices, and crossed her arms across her flour-dusted apron. "Nothing here for you," her lips said, barely moving. Anna's cheeks burned with familiar shame. She'd encountered this before in other towns, the assumption that deafness meant simple-mindedness, that someone who couldn't hear wouldn't be capable of following instructions or working safely around ovens and machinery. But knowing the prejudice existed didn't make facing it any easier to bear. By noon, she'd tried every establishment on Main Street. The pattern never varied: initial curiosity, swift recognition of her condition, immediate rejection. Some people were kinder about it than others, but the result remained the same, as if carved in stone. Anna found herself sitting on the front steps of Hartwell's boarding house, her traveling bag beside her like a faithful old dog that had followed her through too many disappointments. The stage ticket back to Carson City rested in her pocket, tomorrow's departure if nothing changed before then. She'd spent her last few coins on this journey, gambling everything on the possibility that a smaller town might prove more welcoming than the cities where she'd tried and failed to find steady work. The smell of fresh-baked bread drifted from somewhere nearby, making her stomach clench with hunger. She'd eaten nothing since yesterday's meager supper, saving her remaining money for lodging if she could find work, or for the return journey if she couldn't. Mrs. Hartwell emerged from the boarding house, a woman of perhaps 50 with graying hair pinned in a severe bun that pulled the skin tight around her eyes. She wore widow's black and moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing other people's problems without getting emotionally involved. "You'll be needing a room," Mrs. Hartwell said, speaking slowly and clearly. She'd obviously dealt with deaf folks before, or had the wisdom to recognize the signs. "One night's all I can offer on credit. Most people don't stay longer than that." The meaning behind those words struck Anna like a physical blow. Most people like her didn't stay because they couldn't find work, couldn't find acceptance. They moved on with the next stage, carrying their disappointment to the next town, the next failed opportunity. Anna nodded and followed Mrs. Hartwell inside. The boarding house smelled of carbolic soap and boiled cabbage, with an undertone of old wood and older dreams. Her room was small but scrupulously clean, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a single window overlooking Main Street where people went about their ordinary lives. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Hartwell said, then paused at the doorway. "Town's not unkind. You understand. Just careful about strangers, especially ones with—" She gestured vaguely toward her ears, then shook her head. 6 o'clock sharp. Alone in the room, Anna unpacked her few belongings with methodical care. 2 spare dresses, both showing careful repairs. Undergarments mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches. A small Bible with pages soft from handling, and a spine cracked from years of seeking comfort in familiar words. A tintype photograph of her parents, both taken by the fever that had also stolen her hearing when she was 7 years old. She sat on the bed's edge and opened the Bible, not looking for specific verses, but simply holding it for the comfort of weight and familiar texture. Through the window, she watched people going about their daily routines, a man loading supplies into a wagon, children chasing each other down the dusty street, women hanging laundry behind the shops, where it would catch the afternoon breeze. Normal life in a normal town. The kind of life she'd been searching for since leaving the county home at 18, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of reference from the matron who'd taught her to read and write. The church bell tower stood at the far end of Main Street, its bronze bell catching sunlight like a beacon. Anna couldn't hear it ring the hours, but she could see people responding to its call, checking pocket watches, hurrying their steps, gathering children who'd wandered too far from home. Even without sound, the town's rhythm revealed itself to those who knew how to watch and wait. A knock at her door interrupted her observations. Mrs. Hartwell stood in the hallway with a wooden tray balanced in her hands. "Thought you might be hungry. Bread and butter? Some of yesterday's vegetable soup." She set the tray on the washstand with careful precision. "Stage comes through again tomorrow afternoon. If you're planning to, move on." The kindness in her voice carried an undertone of inevitability that Anna recognized. She'd heard it before in other voices, seen it in other faces. The assumption that she would leave, must leave, because staying never worked for people like her. But as Anna sat by the window, eating Mrs. Hartwell's soup and watching the town settle into evening routines, something stubborn hardened in her chest like cooling iron. She'd traveled too far and risked too much to give up after one day of rejection. Tomorrow she'd try again. Maybe someone would see past her deafness to her willingness to work, her clean appearance, her quiet dignity. The sun sank lower, painting the buildings in shades of gold and amber. People began lighting lamps in their windows, creating warm squares of yellow against the gathering dusk. Families sitting down to supper. Men coming home from work. The comfortable rituals of belonging that she'd observed from the outside for so many years. Anna pressed her palm against the cool window glass and made herself a promise. Somewhere in this town, someone needed help. Someone might be willing to give her a chance if she could just find them. She had to believe that, because the alternative, another failed attempt, another town that turned her away, was too heavy to carry much further. The stage ticket remained in her pocket, unexamined. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new doors to approach, new words to write on brown paper. She'd faced rejection before and survived it. She could survive it again, but first, she had to try. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. Jack Holden stood at the general store counter, his calloused fingers drumming against the worn wood, while Pemberton tallied his monthly supplies. Flour, coffee, sugar, lamp oil, the necessities that kept a man fed and his house lit through the long prairie evenings when silence pressed against the windows like a living thing. A woman entered the store, her movements deliberate and careful. Jack glanced up from checking his supply list and noticed her immediately, not because she was particularly striking, but because of the way she held herself. Spine straight despite obvious weariness, chin level despite the nervous flutter of her hands as she approached Pemberton's counter. She pulled out a piece of brown paper and began writing with a pencil stub worn down to almost nothing. Jack couldn't see the words from his angle, but he watched Pemberton's face change as he read. The store owner's expression shifted from mild interest to uncomfortable recognition, then settled into the particular brand of polite dismissal reserved for unwanted solicitors. Pemberton shook his head before the woman finished writing. He turned away, busying himself with arranging bolts of calico that didn't need arranging. The woman's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. She folded the paper with precise movements and tucked it back into her small cloth purse. Jack's jaw muscle twitched. He'd seen that look before, the careful dignity of someone absorbing rejection they'd expected but hoped to avoid. It was the same expression he'd worn coming home from the war. When folks looked at his limp and the scar along his jaw and decided he wasn't fit for the work he'd done before enlisting. "That'll be $4.30, Pemberton said, sliding Jack's supplies across the counter. Jack counted out the coins, but his attention remained on the woman as she walked toward the door. Her steps were measured, unhurried, no dramatic exit, no show of wounded pride, just quiet acceptance of another door closing. The bell above the door chimed as she left, a sound that seemed to linger longer than it should have. "What'd she want?" Jack asked, pocketing his change. Pemberton's mustache twitched with distaste. "Work. Kitchen help or some such nonsense." He lowered his voice as if sharing a confidence. "Deaf as a fence post. That one. Can't hear a blessed thing." Jack loaded his supplies into the wooden crate he'd brought from home. Through the front window, he could see the woman walking toward the hardware store, her brown skirt stirring the dust with each step. The morning sun caught the careful mending on her sleeves, neat stitches that spoke of patience and pride. "Seemed respectable enough," Jack said. "Oh, respectable, certainly." Pemberton adjusted his wire spectacles with ink-stained fingers. "But what use is kitchen help that can't hear instructions, or cleaning help that won't know when you call for them? It's a kindness, really, not encouraging false hope in someone so afflicted." Jack hefted the supply crate and headed for the door. Outside, he loaded the supplies into his wagon bed and untied his horse from the hitching post. The animal, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, nickered softly and nudged Jack's shoulder with his velvet nose. Down the street, the woman emerged from the hardware store. Even from this distance, Jack could read the story in her posture, the slight forward lean of someone who'd been dismissed again, the careful way she smoothed her skirt before entering the next establishment. The bakery door swallowed her, and Jack found himself waiting to see how long she'd stay inside. Not long. She appeared again within minutes, that same piece of brown paper clutched in her hand. Jack climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. Buck stepped forward without prompting, familiar with the route home. But Jack found himself glancing back as they rolled out of town. The woman was standing in front of the boarding house now, her traveling bag at her feet like she'd given up for the day. The ride to his homestead took 20 minutes along a dirt road that wound between stands of cottonwood and stretches of buffalo grass that waved in the constant prairie wind. Jack's place sat in a shallow valley, a log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that needed new shingles, and 40 acres of decent farmland that he worked alone because he'd grown tired of depending on other people's promises. He'd been working it alone for 3 years now, ever since he'd mustered out and used his saved pay to buy the property from a widow who couldn't manage it anymore. The work was hard but honest, and after 4 years of taking orders and fighting other men's battles, the solitude had suited him fine, most of the time. Jack unhitched Buck and led him to the corral, then carried his supplies into the cabin. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a cook stove, and shelves lined with more books than most folks expected a former cavalry sergeant to own. The second chair had been gathering dust since he'd bought it, included in the widow's sale of household goods. He lit the coal oil lamp against the gathering dusk and put coffee on to boil, while it heated. He sat at the table and opened his account ledger. Numbers didn't lie, and the numbers told a clear story. The farm was profitable, but just barely. With winter coming, he needed to maximize his harvest, and 40 acres was too much for one man to handle efficiently. The coffee began to bubble. Jack poured himself a cup and returned to his calculations. He could hire day laborers from town when harvest time came, but that meant paying premium wages for workers who might not show up when he needed them most. What he really needed was reliable help, someone willing to work for fair wages and room and board. Someone like that woman from town. Jack's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips as the thought struck him. He sat perfectly still, steam rising from the dark liquid while his mind worked through the implications. Why exactly had she been turned away from every business in town? Because she couldn't hear instructions. Hell, half the men he'd served with couldn't follow orders they could hear plain as day. At least someone who had to watch and pay attention might actually do what needed doing. The coffee had gone cold in his cup by the time he made his decision. Tomorrow he'd ride back to town and find that woman, if she was still there. If she hadn't already given up and taken the next stage out of Millerville, carrying her dignity and her careful mending to some other town that would probably treat her just the same. But as Jack banked the fire and prepared for bed, one question nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. What if he was already too late? Jack woke before dawn with his decision already crystallized in his mind like frost on winter glass. The coffee from the night before had gone cold in the cup beside his ledger, numbers still scattered across the open pages like evidence of his calculations. He'd sat at that table until past midnight, working through the arithmetic of necessity and coming to the same conclusion each time. 40 acres, one man, harvest approaching fast as a prairie storm. The mathematics didn't lie. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside into the gray, pre-dawn air that carried the scent of dew-wet grass and the distant promise of another scorching day. Buck stood at the corral fence, ears pricked forward at the sound of the cabin door closing. Frost glittered on the split-rail fencing despite the summer season, and Jack's breath made small clouds as he walked to the barn. The morning chores took an hour, feeding Buck a measure of oats, milking the cow that lowed impatiently in her stall, collecting eggs from the handful of hens that scratched and pecked around the farmyard. Basic tasks that barely scratched the surface of what needed doing before first frost painted the valley. The vegetable garden wanted weeding. The hay needed cutting before it went to seed. The barn roof leaked in 3 places that would turn into a dozen when the autumn rains came. Jack saddled Buck while the sun climbed over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him of his mother's favorite quilt. The leather was stiff with morning cold, and the horse danced sideways as the cinch tightened around his barrel. By full daylight, they were on the road to town, Buck's hooves striking a steady rhythm against the packed dirt that had been ground fine as flour by countless wagon wheels. The boarding house sat on a side street off Main, a 2-story building with white clapboard siding and green shutters that needed fresh paint. Mrs. Hartwell maintained a tidy front yard with hollyhocks blooming against a picket fence that showed the careful attention of someone who believed appearances mattered. Jack tied Buck to the fence post and walked up the front path, his spurs chiming softly with each step. The woman sat on the porch steps exactly where he'd hoped and feared he'd find her. Her traveling bag rested beside her like a faithful companion, and she wore the same faded calico dress from yesterday. But she'd pinned a small bunch of wildflowers to her collar daisies and black-eyed Susans that she must have picked from the roadside that morning. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, perfectly still in the way of someone who'd learned to wait without fidgeting. She looked up as his boots hit the porch boards, the sound vibrating through the wooden structure. Her eyes were hazel, he noticed now, with flecks of gold that caught the morning light like tiny coins scattered in dark water. She didn't smile or frown, just watched him approach with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading faces for information that voices couldn't provide. Jack touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," her lips parted slightly, then pressed together. She reached into her cloth purse and pulled out that familiar piece of brown paper, but Jack held up his hand. "Don't need to write anything just yet. Mrs. Hartwell inside." The woman nodded and pointed toward the front door with one gloved finger. Jack knocked twice and waited, listening to footsteps approach from inside, quick, light steps that belonged to a woman who moved with purpose and had little patience for dawdling. Mrs. Hartwell opened the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel that smelled of lye soap and yesterday's cooking. "Mr. Holden, this is unexpected." "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell. Like to speak with your guest, if that's acceptable." Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose like twin question marks. She glanced from Jack to the woman on the steps, then back to Jack with the calculating look of someone reassessing a situation she thought she'd understood. "I see. Well, come in, both of you. We'll use the parlor." The parlor smelled of lemon oil and old roses, with an undertone of must that spoke of rooms kept closed except for special occasions. Antimacassars covered the arms of horsehair furniture that had seen better decades, and a grandfather clock ticked in the corner with the relentless precision of time passing whether folks paid attention or not. Mrs. Hartwell gestured for them to sit, then remained standing near the doorway, close enough to chaperone, far enough to provide the illusion of privacy. Jack pulled a stub of pencil from his vest pocket and reached for the brown paper the woman still held. She hesitated for a moment, then handed it over. The paper was soft from handling, creased where it had been folded and refolded more times than seemed possible. In neat script across the top, he could read, "Good morning. I am seeking employment. Kitchen work, cleaning, laundry, references available." Below that, someone had scrawled "No" in heavy black letters that looked like they'd been pressed hard enough to tear the paper. Jack turned the sheet over and wrote in his careful script, "Jack Holden. Own a farm west of town. Need help with harvest preparation. Room and board plus wages. Work hard. Eat well. You interested?" He handed the paper back. The woman read it twice, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the words. She looked up at him, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that might mean the difference between eating and going hungry. She took the pencil and wrote, "Anna Miller? Yes. Interested. What kind of help? Garden work, chicken tending, house cleaning. Whatever needs doing around a working farm. You comfortable around livestock?" Anna wrote, "Grew up on farm. Parents died when I was 16. Been working since..." Got references. She reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a folded envelope, worn thin from handling and soft as cloth from being carried in too many pockets. Inside were 3 letters, each written on different paper, each bearing a different date spread across the past 2 years. Jack read them slowly, his finger following the lines of careful script. Hotel work in Denver. Excellent character. Reliable. Clean. Hard-working. Kitchen help at a boarding house in Colorado Springs prompt. Thorough. No complaints from guests. Laundry work in Pueblo honest, careful with delicate fabrics, never missed a day. All glowing recommendations, all ending the same way, position eliminated due to circumstances beyond their control. Jack folded the letters and handed them back. Anna watched his face with hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through the skin like bleached bones. "When can you start?" he wrote. Anna's shoulders dropped, as if someone had cut the strings holding them up. She wrote quickly, "Now, if you'll have me." Mrs. Hartwell cleared her throat from the doorway like a steam engine building pressure. "Mr. Holden, might I have a word?" Jack nodded to Anna and followed Mrs. Hartwell into the hallway. She closed the parlor door behind them and lowered her voice to a whisper that still managed to carry the weight of authority. "She's deaf, you know. Figured that out yesterday. Completely deaf. Can't hear a blessed thing. How will you give her instructions? How will she know if there's trouble, a fire, or animals getting loose, or someone calling for help? We'll figure something out." Mrs. Hartwell's mouth compressed into a thin line that spoke of disapproval held in check by good manners. "People will talk. People talk anyway. Usually about things that aren't their concern. An unmarried woman, living on your property without proper supervision. In the hired help cabin, same as any other worker I'd take on." Mrs. Hartwell studied his face with the piercing gaze of someone who'd spent years reading character in the faces of strangers seeking rooms. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal requirement, because she nodded slowly. "She's paid through tonight. You can settle up tomorrow if she decides to stay on." Jack returned to the parlor. Anna sat exactly as he'd left her, hands folded, back straight, waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned that hurrying rarely changed outcomes. He wrote on the paper, "Collect your things. We'll go now." Anna wrote back, "Wages. $1 a week plus room and board. That fair?" Anna stared at the number for a long moment, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the pencil. Her writing was less steady now. "More than fair. Thank you." 10 minutes later, Anna's traveling bag was loaded in the wagon bed, and she sat beside Jack on the front seat, her hands folded in her lap, but her posture straighter than it had been since he'd first seen her. Mrs. Hartwell stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching them drive away. A few other folks had gathered on the sidewalk, the blacksmith wiping his hands on his leather apron, 2 women from the dress shop whispering behind their hands, old Peterson from the hotel leaning on his walking stick. Their faces showed the particular expression reserved for witnessing something that would fuel conversation for weeks to come. Jack guided Buck onto Main Street and toward the western road that led to his valley. Anna sat perfectly still beside him, but he could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a stove that had been banked but not extinguished. At the edge of town, he pulled a pair of worn leather work gloves from his coat pocket and held them out to her without ceremony. Anna took the gloves and turned them over in her hands, examining the leather that had been shaped by years of hard use and softened by sweat and weather. She pulled them on, flexing her fingers to test the fit. They were too large, but not by much. She looked at him and nodded once, a gesture that somehow contained more gratitude than a dozen spoken words could have carried. Jack flicked the reins, and Buck picked up his pace. The town fell away behind them, and ahead lay the valley where his cabin waited among the cottonwoods. But as they crested the first hill, something made Jack glance back toward Millerville. A rider sat motionless on the road behind them, too far away to make out clearly but close enough to see that he wasn't moving, just watching. Jack had learned during the war to pay attention to the prickling sensation between his shoulder blades that meant someone had him in their sights. That sensation was crawling up his spine right now. The rider turned out to be nothing more threatening than young Billy Jameson driving his father's cattle to better grazing land, the dust cloud behind him rising from dozens of hooves rather than suspicious intent. Jack's shoulders relaxed as he recognized the familiar figure, and he guided Buck down the slope toward his valley where morning shadows still pooled in the low places like spilled ink. The cabin came into view, first logs chinked with mud and moss that needed fresh daubing before winter. A stone chimney sending up a thin line of smoke from the banked coals he'd left that morning. Beyond it, the barn squatted like a patient animal, its roof patched with mismatched shingles that told the story of 3 years' worth of storms. The hired help cabin sat 50 yards behind the main house, small but solid, with one window facing east toward where the sun would wake whoever slept inside. Jack pulled up beside the main cabin and climbed down from the wagon, his boots hitting the packed earth with a solid thud that sent a rooster scurrying from beneath the wheels. Anna remained seated, her gaze moving systematically across the property with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. Her eyes lingered on the vegetable garden where weeds had gotten ahead of him during the busy weeks of summer, then shifted to the chicken coop where a few hens scratched in the dirt and eyed the newcomers with suspicious interest. He walked around to her side of the wagon and offered his hand. She accepted the assistance down, her fingers gripping his briefly through the oversized work gloves before she immediately stepped away, maintaining proper distance between employer and employee. Her feet touched the ground, and she stood perfectly still for a moment, breathing in the smell of hay and wood smoke and the particular scent of a working farm manure and chickens and the green smell of growing things. Jack pulled her traveling bag from the wagon bed, surprised by how light it felt in his hands. Whatever Anna Miller owned, it didn't amount to much by way of weight or bulk. They walked across the farmyard toward the small cabin, their footsteps muffled by dust and scattered straw. A rooster strutted out from behind the woodpile, chest puffed with territorial importance, and fixed them with a beady yellow stare that suggested he took his duties seriously. The cabin door stuck slightly warped wood swollen from last week's rain that had drummed on the roof for 3 solid hours. Jack put his shoulder to it and shoved until it opened with a grinding scrape that vibrated through the wood frame. Inside, dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that followed them through the doorway like curious spirits. The single room held everything a person needed for basic living: a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress that rustled when Jack pressed it to test its soundness, a small table scarred by previous occupants, one chair with a cane seat that had seen better years, and a washstand with a ceramic basin that bore a hairline crack but still held water. A stone fireplace occupied the far wall, cold ashes scattered on the hearth like gray snow. The previous occupant, a drifter who'd worked the harvest 2 years ago, had left behind a few items: a tin cup with a dented rim, a bent spoon, and a piece of mirror propped against the windowsill. Jack set Anna's traveling bag on the table and pointed to the bed, then to her, then nodded. the universal language of gesture that crossed all barriers of sound. She understood and nodded back, her hands smoothing the faded calico of her skirt. He moved to the fireplace and knelt to examine the flue, holding his hand beneath the opening to test the draw. Air moved properly when he created a draft, no blockages from birds' nests or debris that would fill the room with smoke come winter. Anna walked to the window and looked out toward the main house, her fingers tracing along the window frame to test its soundness. The glass was cloudy with age and the fingerprints of previous tenants, but it let in sufficient light to make the small space livable. She moved to the washstand and worked the handle of the small hand pump mounted beside the basin. Water spurted out in brown bursts that gradually cleared to a steady stream, running cold and clean from the well. Jack had dug his first month on the property. Anna cupped her hands and let the water pool in her palms, then splashed it against her face. Droplets caught in her eyelashes and rolled down her cheeks, and she dried her face with her sleeve before turning to find Jack watching. He pointed to himself, then to the door, then held up one finger. "Wait here. Be back in a minute." The gestures came naturally, as if he'd been communicating this way for years instead of minutes. Anna nodded and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folding automatically in her lap in the posture of someone accustomed to waiting. Jack walked to the main house and gathered supplies from his pantry and kitchen, a bar of lye soap that would cut through any amount of dirt and grime, clean towels that his neighbor Mrs. Patterson had given him when he'd first moved to the farm, a coal oil lamp with a full reservoir and a glass chimney free of cracks. From the pantry, he took a loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days ago, butter wrapped in cheesecloth and kept cool in the root cellar, and a jar of strawberry preserves that same neighbor had brought by last month after her bushes had produced more fruit than her family could eat. When he returned to the cabin, Anna was sitting exactly where he'd left her, but she'd removed the wildflowers from her collar and arranged them in the tin cup filled with water from the pump. The simple gesture transformed the austere space from abandoned to inhabited, adding color and life to corners that had held nothing but shadows. Jack set the supplies on the table beside the makeshift flower arrangement. Anna's eyes widened when she saw the bread and preserves, her gaze moving from the food to his face with a question written in the tilt of her head. He mimed eating, pointing from the bread to her, then nodded his permission. Her stomach chose that precise moment to growl audibly, a sound loud enough that even she seemed to sense its vibration. Color rose in her cheeks like sunrise on snow. Jack retreated to give her privacy while she settled in and ate. Outside, Buck stood patiently in harness, occasionally stamping at flies that buzzed around his legs in lazy circles. Jack unhitched the horse and led him to the corral, then pushed the wagon into the barn where it would be sheltered from weather and within easy reach when he needed it for hauling hay or supplies to town. The afternoon sun had climbed high enough to make sweat bead on his forehead, despite the cooling breeze that swept down from the mountains. Summer was wearing thin at the edges, but the heat still had teeth that bit deep when a man worked hard under the open sky. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the peaks, afternoon storms building as they did most days this time of year, though they rarely amounted to more than empty threats and a few drops of rain. He found Anna examining the chicken coop with her hands clasped behind her back, observing the half-dozen hens that made up his flock with the careful attention of someone who understood the ways of barnyard fowl. One bird, a speckled Rhode Island red with an attitude that matched her coloring, had wandered close to Anna's feet and was pecking experimentally at the leather laces of her black boots. Anna knelt slowly, moving with deliberate care to avoid startling the bird. The hen cocked its head and studied her with one bright eye that seemed to weigh and measure this new presence in its territory. Anna extended her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed and still. The hen pecked once at her palm, found nothing interesting in the way of corn or scraps, and strutted away with wounded dignity that suggested its feelings had been hurt by the lack of tribute. Jack approached across the packed earth of the farmyard, his boots scuffing against dust and scattered chicken droppings. Anna looked up at him and pointed to the chicken coop, then to herself. tilting her head in a question that needed no words to understand. He nodded and gestured for her to follow him to the vegetable garden. The patch was roughly 20 feet square, bordered by a fence of wooden stakes and chicken wire designed to keep out the rabbits that viewed his crops as their personal dining establishment. Tomato plants drooped on their wooden supports, leaves curling from lack of water and the relentless heat of the summer sun. Weeds had sprouted between the rows of beans and squash, competing with the cultivated plants for moisture and soil nutrients. Jack picked up a hoe that leaned against the fence post and demonstrated the proper technique, chopping weeds with quick, efficient strokes while being careful not to damage the roots of the vegetable plants. Anna watched intently, her eyes following the motion of the blade, the angle of his hands on the smooth wooden handle, the way he positioned his feet for leverage and balance. He handed her the hoe. She gripped it where his hands had been, testing the weight and balance of the tool. Her first stroke was tentative, barely scratching the surface of the packed earth. The second was more confident, the blade biting deeper into the soil. By the third stroke, she'd found the rhythm that would carry her through hours of work without exhausting herself before the job was done. Jack left her to the task and walked back toward the barn. Behind him, he could hear the steady scrape of the hoe blade against earth and the occasional grunt of effort when she encountered a particularly stubborn weed. The sound spoke of progress, of things being set right that had been neglected too long. The milk cow stood in the shade of the barn's overhang, chewing cud with the philosophical patience of an animal that understood its place in the world and found it satisfactory. Bessie was a gentle creature, but she'd grown skittish around strangers since a traveling peddler had spooked her last month by waving his hat too enthusiastically while trying to interest Jack in a set of kitchen knives. Jack filled a bucket at the well and carried it to the cow. Bessie lowered her massive head to drink, water sloshing as she submerged her muzzle and drew the liquid into her mouth with long, steady pulls while she drank. Jack ran his hands along her flanks, checking for cuts or swelling that might indicate injury or illness. The cow was in good condition, her coat glossy, her eyes bright and alert. A movement caught his eye. Anna had stopped hoeing and was walking toward the barn, the tool still gripped in her hands. She moved with purpose rather than uncertainty, not wandering or exploring, but heading directly towards something that had caught her attention. She stopped beside the milk cow and set down the hoe with careful precision. Bessie raised her head from the water bucket, streams dripping from her chin and spattering the dusty ground. The cow and the woman regarded each other across 3 feet of space, with the mutual wariness of strangers taking each other's measure. Anna extended her hand, moving slowly and deliberately. Bessie sniffed at her fingers, then allowed Anna to scratch behind her ears in the spot that made the cow's eyes half close with pleasure. The woman's touch was confident, but not presumptuous. The hands of someone who'd grown up around livestock and understood their moods and temperaments. Jack watched from the barn doorway as Anna continued the gentle scratching, her movements sure and practiced. Bessie leaned into the attention, 1,000 pounds of bovine contentment swaying slightly under the ministrations of someone who clearly knew what she was doing. Then Anna did something that made Jack's breath catch in his throat and his hands go still on the barn door frame. She pressed her cheek against the cow's warm flank and closed her eyes, her face showing an expression Jack had never seen before. Not contentment exactly, but something deeper and more complex. Something that looked like a person who'd been wandering in the cold, finally stepping into a warm room. When Anna opened her eyes and stepped back, Jack pretended to be examining a loose board in the barn wall. But his mind was churning with questions he wasn't sure he had any right to ask. What kind of life had Anna Miller lived that made her find such comfort in the simple warmth of a milk cow's flank? What had driven her to seek work in town after town, carrying nothing but a few belongings and letters of reference that praised her character, but couldn't seem to keep her employed? And why did watching her find a moment of peace in his barnyard make him feel like he'd been holding his breath for 3 years without realizing it? 2 weeks passed like pages turning in a well-worn book, each day following the rhythm that farms impose on those who work them. Anna rose each morning before the sun cleared the eastern hills, her internal clock as reliable as the rooster that strutted around the farmyard, announcing dawn to anyone who cared to listen. Jack would find her already at work when he emerged from the main cabin, weeding the vegetable garden with methodical precision, or scattering corn for the chickens, or pumping fresh water into the livestock troughs with steady strokes that spoke of strength built through necessity. She moved through her tasks with an economy of motion that came from years spent making every movement count. Her hands had toughened quickly, the soft skin developing calluses where the hoe handle rubbed against her palms. The oversized work gloves had molded to fit her grip, the leather darkening with sweat and soil until they looked like they'd been made for her hands rather than borrowed from a man twice her size. The vegetable garden had transformed under her attention like a neglected child suddenly given proper care. Weeds that had choked the tomato plants now lay withered between the rows, their roots exposed to the killing sun. The bean vines climbed their supports in neat spirals, heavy with pods ready for picking. Squash blossoms opened each morning like yellow trumpets, announcing another day of growth and abundance. Jack found himself adjusting his own routines to accommodate her presence, not because she demanded it, but because her way of organizing work made more sense than the haphazard system he'd developed during 3 years of bachelor living. She had reorganized the entire barn according to some internal logic he couldn't immediately grasp. The hay rake now stood beside the scythe, both within easy reach of the barn door where they'd be needed when harvest time came. Smaller tools hung from pegs driven into the wall studs, arranged by size and function rather than scattered wherever they'd been dropped after use. It took him 3 days to realize her system was more efficient than anything he'd devised in his years of farming. This morning, Jack walked to the barn carrying the wooden-handled scythe he kept hanging on pegs inside the main cabin. The grass in the west pasture had grown thick and tall during the recent rains that had blessed the valley with more moisture than they'd seen in 2 dry summers. Too thick for the livestock to graze efficiently, and getting thicker by the day. It needed cutting before it went to seed and became worthless as animal feed. Anna was already in the barn, forking hay into Buck's feeding trough with smooth, practiced motions. The horse whickered softly and nuzzled her shoulder as she worked, no longer treating her as a stranger, but as someone who belonged in his daily routine. She'd learned to read his moods with the instinct of someone who'd grown up around animals when he wanted attention, when he preferred to be left alone to eat in peace, when his ears pinned back in warning that his patience was wearing thin. Jack held up the scythe and pointed toward the pasture where morning light revealed the full extent of the grass that needed cutting. Anna set down the pitchfork and nodded, wiping her hands on the leather apron she'd fashioned from a piece of old harness. They walked together across the farmyard, boots crunching on scattered straw and the inevitable deposits that came with keeping chickens and livestock in close proximity. The rooster followed for a few yards, his chest puffed with the importance of supervising all activities on his territory. Then lost interest and wandered back to terrorize a beetle that had made the mistake of crawling within reach of his sharp beak. The west pasture stretched for roughly 2 acres, bordered by a split-rail fence that Jack had built the previous summer when he'd decided to expand his grazing land. Grass grew knee-high in most places, with patches of thistle and wild mustard scattered throughout like green islands in a rolling sea. Grasshoppers launched themselves from the stems as Jack and Anna waded into the field, their wings catching sunlight like fragments of colored glass thrown by an invisible hand. Jack positioned himself at the fence line and took a practice swing with the scythe. The curved blade whispered through the grass stems, leaving a neat swath of cut vegetation in its wake. He moved forward 2 steps and swung again, the motion automatic after years of practice on his father's farm back in Ohio. Step, swing, step, swing, a rhythm as natural as breathing, as inevitable as sunrise. Anna watched from the fence rail, her eyes following the movement of the blade, the positioning of his feet, the angle of his shoulders as he leaned into each stroke. When he reached the end of the first row and looked back, he found her studying the pattern he'd cut through the tall grass with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail. He walked back to where she stood and offered her the scythe. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted the tool, her hands finding the grip points he'd shown her through demonstration. The handle was longer than the hoe she'd been using for garden work, and considerably heavier, requiring a different stance and a different kind of motion that engaged the entire body rather than just the arms. Anna's first swing went wide, the blade catching nothing but air and throwing her slightly off balance. Her second attempt chopped into the earth, sending up a spray of dirt and severed roots that spoke of too much downward force and not enough horizontal sweep. Jack stepped beside her and demonstrated the proper angle blade parallel to the ground, cutting the grass stems cleanly rather than tearing them or digging furrows in the soil. She tried again. This time the scythe moved through the grass with a satisfying swoosh, leaving behind a ragged but effective cut that would improve with practice. Anna paused and looked at the fallen grass, then at Jack, and for the first time since he'd known her, a genuine smile played at the corners of her mouth, not the careful, guarded expression she wore when dealing with strangers, but something open and pleased. Jack started a new row parallel to hers. Anna fell in beside him, matching his pace but working her own strip of grass at a speed that let her concentrate on technique rather than trying to keep up with his years of experience. Her form was still rough, but she was learning to read the resistance of the stems, adjusting her swing to compensate for thick patches or rocky ground that might catch the blade. They worked in silence, broken only by the whisper of steel through grass and the distant lowing of cattle in the neighboring pasture owned by the Jameson family. Sweat beaded on Anna's forehead and darkened the fabric of her work dress along her spine, despite the morning coolness. She'd rolled her sleeves up past her elbows, revealing arms that had grown visibly stronger during her time on the farm, the muscles more defined beneath skin that had tanned from hours spent working under the open sky. By midday, they'd cut nearly half the pasture. Jack's shirt clung to his back with perspiration that carried the salt taste of hard work, and Anna's face was flushed with heat and exertion, but they'd found a rhythm that felt as natural as the season's two scythes moving in complementary arcs, each worker covering ground at their own pace without interfering with the other's progress. Jack pointed toward the cabin and mimed drinking from a cup. Anna nodded and followed him back across the farmyard where the chickens had taken shelter in whatever shade they could find. In the kitchen, he pumped water into a ceramic pitcher and filled 2 glasses with the cool liquid that carried the mineral taste of deep well water filtered through layers of rock and sand. Anna drank hers in long swallows, water running down her chin and dripping onto her collar where it darkened the faded calico. She set down the empty glass and looked at him directly for the first time in days, not the quick, cautious glances she usually favored when their work brought them into proximity, but a steady gaze that lasted several heartbeats and seemed to carry more weight than words could have managed. Jack refilled her glass and his own, the pump handle creaking with each stroke as it drew water from the depths. Outside, thunder rumbled over the mountains in the distance, though the sky remained clear above the valley where they worked. Afternoon storms had been building daily, but rarely amounted to more than a few drops of rain and some dramatic cloud formations that provided entertainment for anyone with time to watch the sky. Anna walked to the window and looked toward the western hills where dark clouds massed along the peaks like an invading army gathering its forces. She pressed her palm against the window glass, and Jack realized she was feeling for vibrations the only way she could sense the approaching thunder that he could hear as a low rumble carried on the wind. She turned from the window and pointed toward the pasture, then made a gesture he didn't immediately understand, hands moving in a circular motion, then pointing upward toward the threatening sky. It took him a moment to interpret her meaning: the cut grass, the approaching storm, the need to get the crop under cover before rain could ruin hours of work. Jack nodded and reached for his hat where it hung on a peg beside the door. They had perhaps 2 hours before the storm reached the valley, enough time to finish cutting the remaining grass, but not enough to properly dry it before the rain came. Wet hay was worse than no hay at all, prone to mold and rot that could poison livestock and waste an entire day's labor. They returned to the pasture and resumed their work with increased urgency. The scythes moved faster now, less concerned with perfect technique than with covering the remaining ground before weather forced them to stop. Anna's strokes grew more confident as fatigue loosened her shoulders and allowed muscle memory to take over from conscious thought. The wind picked up as they worked, bending the uncut grass and sending cut stems skittering across the field like scattered straw. Anna's hair came loose from its pins and whipped around her face in dark tendrils. She paused to retie it with quick, efficient movements, then returned to her work without missing more than a few strokes. Jack's shoulders began to burn with the familiar ache of sustained effort, the muscles between his shoulder blades knotting with tension that came from hours of repetitive motion. Blisters formed on his palms, despite the calluses built up from years of farm work. The wooden handle of the scythe wearing against skin that was tough but not impervious to friction. Beside him, Anna showed no signs of slowing down, if anything. She seemed to be finding her second wind as the afternoon wore on and the storm clouds gathered strength above the mountain peaks. Her rhythm remained steady, her cuts clean and efficient, her movements economical in the way of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary flourishes. By the time they finished the last row, the western sky had darkened to the color of old pewter, and lightning flickered more frequently among the clouds like candle flames behind frosted glass. The wind carried the smell of rain, now that particular metallic scent that preceded mountain storms, and spoke of moisture building to the point where it could no longer be contained by the sky. Anna leaned on her scythe handle and surveyed the cut pasture where grass lay in neat windrows across the 2 acres they'd cleared. The crop was already beginning to wilt in the heat, which would help it dry faster once the storm passed. Tomorrow, if the weather cooperated, they could rake it into piles for loading onto the wagon and storing in the barn where it would provide feed for the livestock through the coming winter. Jack walked toward the barn to store the scythes in their proper places on the wall pegs Anna had arranged with such careful attention to efficiency. Behind him, he heard her footsteps following, but something in her gait made him turn around to see what had caught her attention. She'd stopped in the middle of the farmyard and was staring at the main cabin's front window with an expression he couldn't immediately read. A face looked back at her from behind the glass, a woman's face framed by the window's wooden trim, pale and watching with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. But Jack had been working in the pasture all afternoon alongside Anna. No one else lived on his property. The cabin had been empty when they'd left for the fields, and he was certain, absolutely certain, that he'd locked that door before they'd gone out to work. Jack's hand tightened on the scythe handle as he stared at the cabin window. The face behind the glass belonged to Mrs. Hartwell, her gray hair visible beneath a black bonnet, her mouth moving in what appeared to be animated conversation with someone else inside his kitchen, someone he couldn't see from this angle, but whose presence filled him with cold certainty that his property had been invaded while he worked his fields. Someone had unlocked his door. Someone had made themselves comfortable in his home while he labored under the afternoon sun, believing his cabin secure and his privacy intact. Jack set the scythe against the barn wall and walked toward the cabin, his boots hitting the packed earth with measured steps that carried the weight of controlled anger. Anna followed a pace behind, her own scythe still gripped in her hands like a tool she wasn't sure whether to use for cutting grass or defending herself. The cabin door stood wide open now, though Jack was certain it had been closed when they'd left for the pasture. Mrs. Hartwell emerged onto the porch, followed by 2 other women Jack recognized from town. Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop, her steel gray hair pinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better seasons, and Mrs. Clemens, the banker's wife, whose husband's position lent her words a weight that extended far beyond her small stature. All 3 wore their Sunday visiting clothes despite the weekday afternoon. their dark skirts and proper bonnets marking this as official business rather than social calling. Their faces carried the particular expression of women who'd come to set things right that had gone wrong in their absence. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes took in Jack's sweat-stained shirt and Anna's disheveled appearance with obvious disapproval that radiated from her like heat from a cook stove. Her lips compressed into the thin line reserved for situations that required delicate handling but firm resolution. "Mr. Holden, we've been waiting nearly an hour." Her tone suggested this waiting had been both unreasonable and unnecessary, as if his work schedule should have anticipated their arrival. Jack reached the porch steps and stopped, close enough to see the dust on their skirts from the road, but maintaining the distance that separated property owners from uninvited guests. "Didn't know I was expecting company." "We knocked several times. When no one answered, I took the liberty of checking inside to ensure everything was proper." Mrs. Hartwell's tone suggested this liberty had been both reasonable and necessary, though her eyes flickered toward Anna with an expression that indicated she'd found things less proper than hoped. The door had been locked when they'd left for the fields, but Jack saw no point in arguing with three women who'd already decided their intrusion was justified by higher concerns than his privacy. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her hands clasped at her waist with the white-knuckled intensity of someone gripping courage she wasn't certain she possessed. "We've come about your arrangement, Mr. Holden." Jack waited, feeling sweat cool on his back as the afternoon breeze carried the scent of approaching rain down from the mountain peaks. Behind him, he could hear Anna's breathing, slightly labored from the day's work, but controlled in the way of someone accustomed to being discussed rather than included in conversations about her fate. "People are talking," Mrs. Clemens said, her voice carrying the authority that came from her husband's position at the town's only bank. "About the propriety of the situation. A young unmarried woman living on your property without suitable supervision or chaperonage. She's working for wages," Jack said, his voice level despite the heat building in his chest. "Same as any hired hand I might take on during harvest season." "But she's not any hired hand, is she?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to a child who refused to understand simple facts. "She's a woman, and you're a bachelor. The arrangement invites speculation about matters that decent people prefer not to discuss openly." Anna moved closer to the porch, her presence suddenly more noticeable as the three women turned their attention to her like judges examining evidence. They took in her work-stained dress, her hair that had come loose during the morning's labor, the scythe she still carried like a badge of honest work accomplished. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose fractionally as she studied Anna's appearance. "Has she been working in the fields alongside you, like a man?" "She's been earning her wages through honest labor." Jack's jaw tightened as he spoke, each word carefully controlled to avoid saying things that couldn't be taken back once spoken. Mrs. Clemens cleared her throat with the delicate sound of someone broaching topics that required careful handling. "Mr. Holden, we're not questioning your intentions or suggesting anything. Improper has occurred, but you must understand how this appears to others who observe from a distance." Jack felt his patience wearing thin like cloth washed too many times. "Don't recall asking for observations from folks who mind other people's business better than their own. Nevertheless," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice sharpening with the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions carry weight, "the community has standards, expectations about how decent people conduct themselves. What you do reflects on all of us who live in this valley." Anna had reached the bottom of the porch steps. She looked up at the three women with an expression Jack couldn't quite read, not defiant, but not apologetic either. Something steadier than either emotion. Something that suggested she'd faced similar judgments before and learned not to bend beneath their weight. Mrs. Patterson addressed Anna directly, speaking slowly and clearly, as if volume could bridge the gap that sound couldn't cross. "Dear child, you must understand the position you've placed yourself in. living here, working alongside Mr. Holden without proper oversight from respectable women. People are beginning to draw conclusions. Anna's gaze moved from Mrs. Patterson to Jack, then back again with the careful attention of someone reading faces for information that voices couldn't provide. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the stub of pencil and piece of brown paper that had become her constant companions, the same paper she'd carried that first day in town, now soft from handling and marked with the conversations that had shaped her life since arriving in Millerville. She wrote something with quick, decisive strokes and handed the paper to Mrs. Patterson. The woman read it, her expression shifting through surprise, discomfort, and something approaching embarrassment as the words registered. "What does it say?" Mrs. Clemens asked, leaning closer to read over Mrs. Patterson's shoulder. Mrs. Patterson folded the paper carefully, as if the words might escape if not properly contained. She writes that she's grateful for honest work and fair treatment. She asks what exactly people are saying about her character, and whether anyone has witnessed improper behavior to support their concerns. Mrs. Hartwell took the paper and read it herself, her mouth tightening further as she processed Anna's direct challenge to their veiled accusations. She also asks if anyone has bothered to speak with her directly before reaching conclusions about her situation. The three women exchanged glances that spoke of conversations held in parlors and over teacups, where reputations could be dissected and judgments rendered without the inconvenience of first-hand knowledge. Mrs. Clemens was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. "The girl has spirit. I'll grant that. But spirit doesn't change the fundamental facts of the situation. An unmarried woman living alone with a bachelor creates circumstances that invite gossip, whether or not anything actually improper has occurred." Jack stepped onto the porch, bringing himself level with the three women and close enough to smell the lavender water Mrs. Patterson used to scent her clothes. "Miss Miller works hard, keeps to herself, and causes no trouble for anyone. Can't see how that's anyone's business but mine and hers." "But it is our business," Mrs. Hartwell insisted, her voice rising slightly with the passion of someone defending principles she considered sacred. "We're a community, Mr. Holden. What affects one person affects us all. Surely you can understand that basic truth." Anna wrote something else on the paper and handed it to Jack. He read it quickly, then passed it to Mrs. Patterson without comment. Curious to see how they would respond to Anna's latest challenge, Mrs. Patterson read the note aloud, her voice growing quieter with each word. "She says she can find other work if her presence here causes problems for the community. She doesn't want to be the source of trouble for Mr. Holden or anyone else." The words hung in the afternoon air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that none of them had expected to face. The suggestion sounded reasonable on its surface, even noble in its consideration for others' comfort. But underneath lay the same assumptions that had driven Anna from business to business that first morning in town, that she was somehow different, somehow requiring special handling that other workers didn't need. Jack felt something cold settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "She stays." Mrs. Clemens blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon." "Miss Miller stays. Works here, lives here. Same as we agreed when I hired her." Mrs. Hartwell's voice took on the sharp edge of someone whose patience had been stretched beyond its limits. "Mr. Holden, you're not considering the consequences of this decision, for yourself or for her. People will draw their own conclusions about the arrangement. They may stop doing business with you." The bank holds no paper on my land," Jack interrupted, his voice remaining level, but carrying an undertone that made all three women take a step backward. "My business dealings are with folks who care more about fair treatment and honest work than they do about idle gossip and manufactured scandal." Mrs. Patterson made one final attempt at persuasion, her hands fluttering with nervous energy. "Please, both of you, consider what we're saying. There are ways to make this arrangement more acceptable to the community, more respectable. Proper chaperonage could be arranged. Or perhaps Miss Miller could take lodging in town and come out to work during the daylight hours only. Anna wrote again, her pencil moving across the paper with swift strokes that spoke of words that had been waiting to be written. This time she handed the paper directly to Jack, meeting his eyes as she did so with an expression that seemed to carry years of accumulated experience dealing with similar situations. Jack read the note and looked at Anna, seeing something in her face that made his decision even more certain than it had been moments before. He turned back to the three women and read Anna's words aloud. Says here, she's never felt safer or been treated with more respect than she has on this farm. Says anyone who has genuine concerns about propriety is welcome to come see for themselves how decent people behave toward one another. Thunder rolled across the valley, closer now, and carrying the promise of the storm that had been building all afternoon. The first fat raindrops began to fall, spattering the dust and sending the chickens scurrying for whatever shelter they could find beneath the porch and outbuildings. Mrs. Hartwell pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the electricity that preceded mountain storms. We'll be going then, Mr. Holden. But think carefully about what we've said, both of you. Some decisions can't be easily undone once they're made. The three women hurried toward their buggy, their skirts lifting in the wind as they climbed into the vehicle with less dignity than they'd possessed when arriving. Jack and Anna watched from the porch as the buggy rolled away, wheels splashing through puddles that were already forming in the low spots of the rutted road. When the dust from their departure had settled and the sound of wheels had faded into the distance, Anna pulled the pencil and paper from her pocket again. She wrote quickly, her hands steady despite everything that had just transpired, and handed the note to Jack. He read it twice before the full meaning penetrated the anger that still simmered in his chest like banked coals. I understand if you need me to leave. I don't want to cause trouble for you or damage to your reputation. Jack looked at Anna, standing there in her work-stained dress with grass seeds caught in her hair, ready to walk away from the first place that had given her a real chance rather than burden him with the consequences of treating her like a human being deserving of respect and fair wages. The rain began in earnest now, drumming on the cabin roof and creating streams of water that cascaded from the eaves in silver curtains. But as Jack opened his mouth to tell Anna she wasn't going anywhere, the sound of hoofbeats penetrated the noise of the storm. A lone rider was approaching through the rain, bent low over his horse's neck against the driving water, moving with the urgency of someone who had important business that couldn't wait for better weather. And even through the gray curtain of falling rain, Jack could see the dull gleam of metal pinned to the rider's vest, the unmistakable shape of a lawman's badge, catching what light remained in the storm-darkened afternoon. The rider pulled up short at the edge of the farmyard, his horse's hooves sliding in the mud that had formed beneath the driving rain in the span of minutes. Sheriff Morrison sat his saddle like a man who'd ridden hard through weather that would have sent sensible folks indoors. Water streaming from the brim of his hat and darkening his wool coat until it looked black as midnight. Jack stepped to the edge of the porch, one hand gripping the wooden rail hard enough to feel splinters bite into his palm. Behind him, Anna pressed herself against the cabin wall, her breathing quick and shallow like a cornered animal testing the air for escape routes. Morrison swung down from his horse and tied the reins to the porch post with movements made clumsy by cold and wet leather. Water ran off his coat in rivers as he climbed the steps, his boots leaving dark prints on the weathered boards that would take hours to dry. Jack. Morrison touched the brim of his hat, sending a cascade of water onto the porch floor. He nodded toward Anna without quite meeting her eyes. Miss Sheriff, hell of a day for riding. Jack's voice stayed level, but his knuckles had gone white where they gripped the rail. Morrison's eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and cold as creek water in January. Rain dripped from his mustache as he spoke, each word measured like coins counted into a merchant's palm. Got word there was trouble out this way. Came to investigate. Jack felt his shoulders lock into the rigid posture he'd learned during 4 years of military service. What kind of trouble? The kind that involves respectable women making formal complaints about situations they consider improper. Morrison's gaze flicked to Anna, then back to Jack. Mrs. Hartwell stopped by my office after her visit here. She was considerably upset about what she'd witnessed. And lightning split the sky above the mountain peaks, illuminating the farmyard in stark white relief for the space of a heartbeat. In that brief flash, Jack saw the cut hay lying in sodden rows across the pasture, 2 weeks of backbreaking work, turning to useless mush under the relentless storm that showed no signs of passing. "Don't see any improper situation here," Jack said, his voice carrying the flat tone he'd used when addressing superior officers who'd made decisions he couldn't agree with but had to accept. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that Jack could smell the wet wool of his coat and the tobacco that stained his teeth brown as old leather. "Maybe not from your perspective, but appearances matter in a small community like ours. People get to talking, and talking leads to the kind of trouble nobody wants to handle." Anna moved along the wall like a shadow, putting more distance between herself and the two men. Her hand fumbled for the door handle of the small cabin where she'd been staying, not the main house, but the separate structure where any reasonable person could see she maintained proper quarters away from her employer. "Miss Miller?" Morrison called, his voice sharp enough to cut through the sound of rain drumming on the roof. Anna froze with her fingers white against the door handle. "Like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." Anna turned slowly, and even in the dim light from the cabin windows, Jack could see terror written across her face, not the simple wariness of someone facing authority, but something deeper and more primal. Something that spoke of experiences with men who wore badges and used their power in ways that had nothing to do with justice. Morrison pulled a folded telegram from his coat pocket, the yellow paper already darkening with moisture that made the ink run in places. "Received this from Colorado Springs yesterday morning. Sheriff, there's been looking for a woman who matches your description exactly. Anna Miller, approximately 25 years old, deaf, traveling alone without family or proper supervision." Jack's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Anna's face had gone the color of fresh milk, so pale that the freckles across her nose stood out like scattered pepper. "What's the charge?" Jack asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. Morrison unfolded the telegram with deliberate care, squinting to read the smeared ink in the poor light. "Theft of a substantial sum of money from the hotel where she was employed. Owner believes she took it when she departed town without giving proper notice to her supervisors." Anna's mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged from her throat. She pressed both hands against the cabin wall behind her, as if trying to push herself through the solid wood and disappear into the storm beyond. "That's a serious accusation," Jack said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You got any actual proof to support it?" "Got a physical description that matches perfectly. Got timing that works out precisely right. Got a woman who left town in suspicious haste without providing adequate explanation." Morrison folded the telegram and returned it to his pocket. "That's sufficient grounds to ask detailed questions." Thunder crashed directly overhead, so close that the cabin windows rattled in their frames like chattering teeth. Anna flinched as if the sound had struck her physically, though Jack knew she couldn't hear the noise that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. "What kind of questions?" Jack asked. "Questions about why she departed Colorado Springs in such unusual haste. Questions about where she obtained the funds necessary for stage fare and traveling expenses. Questions about what personal belongings she might have in her possession that could shed light on her recent activities." Anna's breathing had become rapid and shallow, her chest rising and falling like a bird trapped in a cage too small to spread its wings. Her hands moved from the wall to her throat, fingers pressing against the pulse point as if checking to ensure her heart still functioned. Maybe we should continue this conversation inside, Morrison suggested, glancing toward the open doorway of the main cabin. Out of this weather that's fit for neither man nor beast. Jack looked at Anna's face and saw something that made his chest tighten like a fist closing around his lungs. Not guilt, he'd seen enough guilty men during the war to recognize the telltale signs of conscience wrestling with deception. This was something entirely different. This was the expression of someone who'd been falsely accused before and understood how powerless truth could be when matched against suspicion and prejudice. "She's not going anywhere," Jack said. "You want to search her belongings. You'll need to get yourself a proper warrant from the judge." Morrison's eyes narrowed to slits that caught what light remained in the storm-darkened afternoon. "Don't need a warrant to ask questions, Jack. And I'm thinking maybe you don't know quite as much about your hired help as you assumed you did." Anna pushed away from the wall and walked toward them, her steps unsteady on the wet porch boards that had become slick as ice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brown paper she'd been using to communicate, along with her pencil stub that had worn down to barely more than a splinter. She wrote quickly, her hand shaking so violently that the pencil skittered across the wet paper and left jagged marks like the tracks of a wounded animal. She handed the note to Morrison with fingers that trembled like leaves in a high wind. The sheriff read it, his expression remaining as unchanged as carved stone. "Says here she never stole anything from anyone. Claims the money went missing after she'd already departed. And they're blaming her because she can't defend herself properly against false accusations." Anna wrote again, faster this time, her pencil moving across the paper with desperate urgency. Morrison read the second note and looked up at her with something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't been mixed with professional skepticism. "Says she has references from 3 different previous positions. Says she's never been in any kind of trouble with law enforcement before this accusation." Morrison folded the notes and handed them back to Anna. "Problem is, misreferences can be forged by anyone with decent handwriting. And people facing desperate circumstances sometimes do desperate things they never imagined they'd be capable of." The rain intensified, driving horizontally across the porch now with a force that seemed determined to wash away everything in its path. Jack could see it pooling in the low places of the farmyard, turning the packed earth into a swamp that would be impassable for days once the storm finally moved on. The chickens had found shelter wherever they could manage it, huddled shapes barely visible through the gray curtain of falling water. Anna walked to the porch rail and gripped it with both hands, her knuckles showing white as bone through skin that had been tanned by weeks of outdoor work. For a moment that stretched like pulled wire, Jack thought she might vault over the railing and run into the rain, disappear into the darkness beyond the farmyard like a wild animal returning to the forest where it belonged. Instead, she turned back to Morrison and began writing again, with the deliberate care of someone crafting words that might mean the difference between freedom and imprisonment. This note took longer than the others. Her hand moved across the paper with painstaking precision, forming each letter with the concentrated attention of someone who understood that handwriting could be analyzed and judged. When she finished, she handed the paper to the sheriff and waited with the stillness of someone who'd learned that movement could be interpreted as guilt. Morrison read the note twice before speaking, his voice dropping to a tone that suggested he was beginning to question his own assumptions. "She says she knows how this situation appears to someone viewing it from the outside. Says she's grown accustomed to being blamed for things she didn't do because people assume she can't adequately defend herself or tell her side of any story. Says if I want to arrest her based on suspicion and circumstantial evidence, she won't resist. But she refuses to confess to crimes she didn't commit." Jack stared at Anna as she met his gaze directly for the first time since Morrison had arrived. In her eyes, he saw not fear now, but something harder and more durable, something that looked like the resolve of someone who'd decided to stop running from accusations she couldn't escape no matter how far she traveled. Lightning flashed again, closer this time and bright enough to illuminate the entire farmyard in stark detail. In that brief moment of brilliant white light, Jack saw something that made his stomach drop like a stone thrown into deep water. A second rider had appeared at the edge of the farmyard, sitting motionless on his horse in the driving rain like a statue carved from shadow and malice. Unlike Morrison, this man made no move to approach the cabin or announce his presence. He simply sat there, in the storm-lashed darkness, watching and waiting with the patience of a predator that had been stalking its prey for longer than anyone suspected. And Jack could swear he'd seen that same silhouette before the night he'd brought Anna home from town, when he'd thought he glimpsed riders on the road behind them. Someone had been watching his farm for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. The question that turned his blood cold was simple. What did they want with Anna Miller that was worth following her across half the territory? Jack pointed toward the second rider, his finger cutting through the rain-soaked air like a blade. "Friend of yours, Sheriff." Morrison turned to follow Jack's gaze, water streaming from his hat brim as he squinted through the storm. The rider remained motionless at the edge of the farmyard, his form barely visible through the gray curtain of rain that had turned the world into a watercolor painting left out in the weather. Lightning flickered again, illuminating a lean face beneath the hat brim, angular features that Jack didn't recognize from town or the surrounding farms. "Never seen him before in my life," Morrison said, but his hand drifted toward the revolver, holstered at his hip with the unconscious movement of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts about potential trouble. "You expecting more company on a night like this?" "No." The stranger urged his horse forward at a deliberate walk, hooves squelching in the mud that had formed where the farmyard's packed earth couldn't absorb the relentless downpour. He stopped 20 feet from the porch, close enough to speak without shouting over the storm, far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening to men who were already on edge. His coat hung open despite the rain, revealing a vest and the glint of a watch chain that caught what little light remained in the storm-darkened afternoon. "Evening, gentlemen. Miss?" His voice carried a slight accent Jack couldn't immediately place, not Southern, not Eastern, but something that spoke of cities and education, and the kind of confidence that came with authority. Terrible weather for conducting business of any kind. Anna had gone rigid against the cabin wall, her entire body frozen like a deer that had caught the scent of a mountain lion on the wind. Her fingers clawed at the wooden siding behind her, and her breathing came in short, sharp gasps that misted in the cold air and spoke of terror that went bone deep. "State your business," Morrison said, his voice taking on the official tone he used when dealing with strangers who appeared at inconvenient times in inconvenient places. The stranger smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect for a man who'd spent years in the saddle. Water dripped from his mustache as he spoke. "Same as yours, I'd imagine. Sheriff, I've been looking for Miss Anna Miller for quite some time now, longer than you might expect." Jack felt ice crystals form in his chest cavity, each breath burning like he'd inhaled winter air at high altitude. "Who's asking?" "Detective Samuel Brennan, Pinkerton National Detective Agency." Brennan reached inside his coat with deliberate slowness and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a badge and identification papers that looked official even in the poor light. "Miss Miller's former employer in Colorado Springs retained our services to investigate certain financial irregularities that occurred during her tenure." Morrison stepped forward, squinting at the credentials through the rain that made everything harder to see and harder to verify. "Pinkertons. Should have mentioned you were working this case when I received the initial telegram. Professional courtesy, Sheriff. Didn't want to step on local jurisdiction or complicate your own investigation." Brennan returned the wallet to his coat with the same deliberate care he'd used to produce it. "Though I understand you've already received the relevant correspondence regarding Miss Miller's situation." Anna pushed away from the wall and walked to the porch rail with steps that seemed to require conscious effort, as if her legs had forgotten how to function properly. Her knuckles showed white as old bone where she gripped the wooden banister, and Jack could see tremors running through her shoulders like earthquake aftershocks. She pulled out her paper and pencil with hands that shook so violently she nearly dropped both items. Her writing was barely legible, jagged marks that looked more like the scratches of a wounded animal than human script. She handed the note to Jack with fingers that couldn't hold steady. Says she's never seen this man before in her life. Jack read aloud, his voice carrying across the porch despite the drumming rain. Brennan's smile widened, showing more of those perfect teeth. I wouldn't expect her to remember me. Mr. Holden. Mr. Holden. My profession requires a certain discretion in observation. I've been monitoring Miss Miller's activities for several weeks now, gathering evidence and documentation to support the charges that will inevitably be filed. What kind of evidence? Morrison asked, his hand still resting near his weapon. The kind that demonstrates a clear pattern of criminal behavior spanning multiple jurisdictions. Brennan pulled a manila envelope from his saddlebags, the paper already darkening with rain despite his efforts to protect it. Miss Miller has been employed at 5 different establishments over the past 2 years. In each case, she departed suddenly and without adequate notice. In each case, significant sums of money disappeared shortly after her departure. Anna wrote again, her hand shaking so hard the pencil left jagged marks across the wet paper. Jack read her words with growing anger that burned hot enough to cut through the ice in his chest. She says that's a complete fabrication. Says she gave proper notice at every position and left with written references attesting to her character and work performance. Brennan dismounted and climbed the porch steps, water streaming from his boots and coat. He opened the envelope and handed Jack a sheaf of papers that felt damp despite being protected from direct rain. I have comprehensive documentation suggesting otherwise. Employment records showing abrupt departures, police reports filed after thefts were discovered, sworn testimony from employers who trusted her and were repaid with betrayal. Anna's legs seemed to give out beneath her. She sat down hard on the porch steps, her skirt spreading around her like a dark pool of fabric. Her face had gone gray as old ash, and she pressed one hand to her chest as if trying to slow a heart that hammered against her ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. Jack examined the documents with growing skepticism. The papers were official-looking enough, but details began to stand out as he read more carefully. The timing of the alleged thefts didn't always match Anna's departure dates. The amounts of money involved seemed to change between different reports. Most telling, the handwriting on several documents looked suspiciously similar, despite supposedly coming from different sources. These don't prove she took anything, Jack said, handing the papers back. Just that money went missing at various times, after she left employment in each case, without exception. Brennan's voice carried the patient tone of someone who'd explained these same facts multiple times to people too slow or stubborn to understand their obvious implications. Pattern evidence is often more compelling than direct proof. Mr. Holden. Morrison reached for the documents. Mind if I examine these myself? As the papers changed hands, a sudden gust of wind caught the top sheet and tore it from Morrison's grip. The paper tumbled across the porch like a dying leaf and landed in a puddle at Anna's feet. She reached down and picked it up, her eyes scanning the water-blurred text with the desperate intensity of someone looking for salvation in words that might condemn her. Anna went completely still. Her breathing stopped, her hand frozen halfway to her pocket where she kept her pencil. She stared at the soggy paper for a long moment that stretched like pulled wire, then looked up at Brennan with something entirely new written across her features. Not fear anymore. Recognition. She wrote quickly and handed the note to Jack, her movements sharp with sudden urgency. His blood turned cold as Arctic water when he read her words. She says this police report is signed by Detective S. Brooks from the Colorado Springs Police Department, but the badge you just showed us said Samuel Brennan, Pinkerton Agency. Brennan's smile faltered for just an instant, a crack in the facade that lasted no longer than a heartbeat but revealed something ugly underneath. Administrative error. Different jurisdictions sometimes use different names on official paperwork to avoid confusion between agencies. Anna wrote again. Faster this time, her pencil racing across the paper with desperate speed. Jack read her words aloud, each syllable landing like a physical blow. She says Samuel Brooks was the house detective at the Denver Palace Hotel in Colorado Springs. Says he was terminated for stealing from guests' rooms and tried to frame her when the hotel owner discovered his crimes. The silence that followed stretched between them like a wire pulled taut enough to snap. Rain drummed on the roof with mechanical persistence, and lightning flickered in the distance as the storm began its slow migration toward the eastern plains. But on the porch, 4 people stood frozen in a tableau of accusation and recognition. Morrison's hand moved fully to his gun now, the leather holster creaking as his fingers found the grip. That true, Brennan, or Brooks, or whatever your real name might be. Brennan's coat flapped open in the wind, revealing not just the watch chain, but also the butt of a revolver tucked into his waistband. His fingers drummed against his thigh in a nervous rhythm, and his eyes darted between Morrison's weapon and the darkness beyond the porch, where escape might still be possible. Simple misunderstanding, he said, but the confidence had drained from his voice like water from a broken bucket. Paperwork gets confused when you're working multiple cases across different territories. Anna stood slowly, using the porch rail for support like an old woman rising from a sickbed. She wrote one more note, but instead of handing it to Jack or Morrison, she let the paper fall to the wet boards at her feet. Her message lay face up in a puddle, ink already bleeding into the rainwater. He's been following me for 8 months, not investigating crimes, hunting me. Jack looked at Brennan and saw the truth written in the man's face like words carved in stone, the predatory patience of someone who'd been stalking prey across half the continent. Anna hadn't been running from justice or trying to escape the consequences of theft. She'd been running from him. Morrison's revolver cleared its holster with practiced speed, the barrel centering on Brennan's chest with the certainty of long experience. Easy now, friend. Let's all keep this civilized. But Brennan's eyes had shifted to Anna, and Jack saw something in them that made his skin crawl like insects walking across his spine. Not the impersonal focus of a lawman pursuing justice, but something intimate and possessive. Something that spoke of ownership claimed and prey that had escaped for far too long. You can't run forever, Anna, Brennan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. I told you in Colorado Springs that I'd always find you. Distance doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter. I'll always be right behind you. Anna's face went white as fresh snow. She took a step backward, then another, until she pressed against the cabin door. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged from her throat except the rasp of breath drawn too quickly through airways constricted by terror. Jack moved between them, his body shielding Anna from Brennan's gaze. The protective instinct that had kept him alive through 4 years of war blazed to life like a banked fire suddenly given fresh air. Think it's time you rode on, mister. Whatever your real name happens to be. Brennan looked at Morrison's drawn weapon, then at Jack's protective stance, then back at Anna's face where absolute terror had replaced every other expression. His smile returned, but now it carried an edge like broken glass that promised cuts deep enough to leave permanent scars. This conversation isn't finished, he said, backing down the porch steps with his hands held visible until he reached his horse. She knows what she owes me, and she knows I always collect my debts. He swung into his saddle and rode back into the storm, but not toward town. Instead, he headed east toward the mountains where a man could find 1,000 places to hide and watch and wait for his next opportunity. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the steady drumming of rain, Morrison holstered his weapon and turned to Anna. She had slid down the cabin door until she sat on the wet boards, her arms wrapped around her knees like a child trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Miss, Morrison said gently, I think it's time you told me what really happened in Colorado Springs." Anna looked up at him with eyes that held years of accumulated fear and exhaustion. She reached for her pencil with trembling fingers and began to write on a fresh piece of paper, her hand shaking so badly that the words came out in jagged scratches. The note she handed to Morrison was longer than any she'd written before, covering both sides of the paper with cramped script that told a story of harassment, false accusations, and a man who'd used his position to torment someone who couldn't defend herself with words. Morrison read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. "Says here, Brooks was stealing from hotel guests and hiding the stolen items in her room to frame her if he was caught. When the hotel owner found the evidence, Brooks claimed she was his accomplice and demanded certain favors in exchange for his silence." Jack felt something hot and ugly rise in his chest like bile. "How long has he been following her?" Morrison read further, his jaw tightening. 8 months. Following her from job to job, town to town, showing up wherever she tries to build a new life and making sure potential employers hear about her supposed criminal record. Anna wrote again with hands that trembled like leaves in a high wind. Morrison read her latest message and shook his head with disgust. She says he promised to leave her alone if she agreed to his arrangements. When she refused and tried to expose his thefts, he swore he'd make sure she never found peace anywhere in the territory. The three of them sat in silence, broken only by the diminishing rain and the distant rumble of thunder moving away toward the eastern plains. Anna looked smaller somehow, as if telling the truth had cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Her shoulders shook with exhaustion or cold or both. Jack knelt beside her on the wet porch boards, close enough to offer comfort without violating the boundaries that separated them. "He's gone now." Anna's laugh was bitter and soundless, more of a shudder that ran through her entire body. She wrote one final note and handed it to him with hands that had given up trying to stay steady. Jack's hands clenched into fists as he read her words. "He'll be back. Men like him always come back. And next time, you might not be here to protect me." In the distance, lightning still flickered over the mountain peaks, where a man with a false name and real malice had disappeared into the storm, but much closer. Jack could swear he heard something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up like a dog sensing danger. The sound of a horse moving through the darkness beyond the farmyard, circling back with the patience of a predator that had learned to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. 3 weeks had passed since Sheriff Morrison rode away with enough evidence to wire the Colorado authorities about Samuel Brooks and his false credentials. The storm that night had broken the oppressive summer heat, leaving behind cooler days and clear skies that stretched like blue silk over the valley where Jack worked his land with help that had proven more valuable than he'd dared hope. Jack stood at the kitchen window, watching Anna move between the rows of the vegetable garden with the efficient grace of someone who'd found her proper place in the world. The plants had not only recovered from the storm damage, but thrived under her careful attention. She filled her wicker basket with the last tomatoes of the season and late beans that would keep them fed through the first weeks of autumn. A wagon rolled up the dirt drive, dust trailing behind its iron-rimmed wheels like a brown ribbon unfurling across the valley floor. Then another wagon appeared, and another, and by noon, 5 families had arrived at Jack's farm: the Pattersons, the Clemens family, the Jamesons, and 2 others Jack recognized from town, but had never spoken with beyond polite nods on Main Street. The men unhitched their horses and gathered around Jack's barn, their voices carrying the comfortable rhythm of neighbors discussing crops and weather and the dozen small concerns that bound farming communities together. The women spread quilts over sawhorses to create tables for the harvest feast, their movements practiced from years of organizing similar gatherings where food and fellowship mixed in equal measure. Mrs. Patterson approached the garden where Anna knelt beside the tomato plants, her weathered hands sorting the ripe fruit from those that needed more time to reach maturity. The older woman moved slowly, her hands clasped in front of her dark skirt, but her approach lacked the hesitation that had marked their earlier encounters. Anna looked up and nodded a greeting, then returned to her work with the focused attention she brought to all her tasks. Mrs. Patterson knelt beside her without invitation and began picking tomatoes, dropping them into Anna's basket with the easy cooperation of women who understood that work shared was work lightened. They labored in comfortable silence for several minutes before Mrs. Patterson pulled a piece of paper from her pocket and wrote something with a pencil stub. Anna read the note and looked at Mrs. Patterson with genuine surprise, brightening her features. She took the pencil and wrote back, her response brief but heartfelt. Mrs. Patterson read Anna's reply and smiled, not the careful, measured expression she'd worn during their previous encounters, but something warm and spontaneous that transformed her entire face. The two women continued their wordless conversation through written notes that passed back and forth like letters between old friends. Gradually, other women drifted over to the garden. Mrs. Clemens approached first, then Mrs. Jameson, then the younger women whose names Jack was still learning. Soon 6 women knelt in the rich soil, filling baskets and sharing thoughts on paper that created bonds words alone couldn't have forged. Jack turned away from the window as footsteps approached the cabin. Old Jameson stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and an expression on his weathered face that spoke of a man preparing to admit he'd been wrong about something important. "Jack, good to see the harvest came in strong despite that hellish storm we had. Strong enough to see us through winter." Jack opened the door wider. "Come in. Coffee's still hot from this morning." Jameson entered and accepted a cup of coffee, but he remained standing near the window where he could watch the women working in the garden. His eyes followed Anna as she showed Mrs. Clemens how to identify which tomatoes were ready for picking and which needed more time on the vine. "That's quite a sight," Jameson said, gesturing toward the garden with his coffee cup. "Been a long time since I've seen Melinda Patterson take to someone new the way she's taken to your hired help." "Mrs. Patterson's a good judge of character." "She is indeed. Sharp eye for people. That woman. And she's been saying things about Miss Miller that got me thinking about assumptions I might have made too hastily." Jameson sipped his coffee and continued watching the garden where Anna was now demonstrating proper technique for harvesting beans without damaging the vines. Through the window, Jack could see Anna showing Mrs. Clemens' young daughter how to gather eggs from the chicken coop without frightening the hens. The child, maybe 6 years old, had detached herself from her mother's supervision and followed Anna across the farmyard with the fearless curiosity of childhood. Anna noticed the girl's interest and knelt to her level, gesturing for the child to follow her into the chicken enclosure. She opened the gate with careful movements and led the girl inside, showing her how to remain still while the hens investigated this new presence in their territory. The child giggled a sound clear enough to carry through the closed window as the boldest hen pecked gently at her outstretched palm. Anna reached into her apron pocket and produced a handful of corn, placing some kernels in the girl's small hand. The chickens flocked to the offering, their beaks careful and precise as they picked up each kernel. "Would you look at that?" Jameson murmured, setting down his coffee cup. "Little Sarah's been afraid of chickens since she could walk. Her mother's despaired of ever getting her comfortable around barnyard animals. Now look at her." Anna guided the child's hands as she gathered eggs, showing her how to reach under the brooding hens without startling them. Sarah's face glowed with accomplishment as she placed each warm egg carefully in Anna's gathering basket, her small hands steady despite her excitement. "Children have instincts about people that adults sometimes ignore," Jameson said. "They can sense things we miss when we get too caught up in appearances and assumptions. If Sarah trusts her completely, that speaks louder than any reference letter could." More wagons arrived throughout the afternoon, bringing families from farms scattered across the valley and beyond. By evening, the farmyard bustled with the controlled chaos of a community celebration. Men gathered around tables laden with roasted chicken, fresh corn on the cob, and vegetables from Anna's carefully tended garden. Children ran between the adults like young colts testing their speed, their laughter mixing with the deeper voices of their parents and grandparents. Anna moved quietly among the groups, refilling water pitchers from the well and collecting empty plates that needed washing. She'd changed from her work dress into a clean blue calico with white buttons that caught the lamplight. her hair pinned neatly beneath a small lace cap that Mrs. Patterson had given her the week before. Several people nodded respectfully as she passed, and more than one person made the effort to catch her attention and express their thanks through gestures and written notes. Jack found himself studying Anna's face as she interacted with the gathering crowd. The wariness that had marked her first weeks on the farm had faded like morning mist in sunlight, replaced by something steadier and more confident. She belonged here now, whether the community had initially planned it that way or not. Young Sarah appeared at Anna's elbow again, tugging on her apron strings to get her attention. Anna knelt so the child could whisper in her ear, forgetting, as children do, that Anna couldn't hear the secrets she wanted to share, but Anna seemed to understand the gesture anyway, nodding seriously and taking the girl's hand. Together they walked back to the chicken coop where the hens were settling onto their roosts for the night. Anna lifted Sarah up so she could reach the drowsy birds, and the child's small hands moved gently over the soft feathers while the chickens tolerated the attention with sleepy patience. "Never seen anything quite like it," said a voice behind Jack. He turned to find Sheriff Morrison approaching with a plate of food in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "That child's been terrified of anything with feathers since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. Now she's petting those hens like they're house cats. Anna has a gift with animals. And with children, apparently." Morrison nodded toward the chicken coop where Anna was now showing Sarah how to scatter scratch grain for the roosting birds. "Got final word back from Colorado Springs last week. That fraud who called himself Detective Brennan, real name Samuel Brooks, he's been arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft, impersonation of an officer, and harassment. Turns out he'd been running similar confidence games in 3 different territories." Jack felt a knot of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally loosen in his chest. "Anna know about this. Figured you'd want to tell her yourself when the time seemed right." Morrison took a bite of cornbread and chewed thoughtfully. "Also figured she might be interested to learn that the hotel owner in Colorado Springs sent an official letter of apology, along with an offer to provide her with the finest reference he's ever written. Seems they found all the money Brooks had stolen hidden in his own room, just like she said." Across the farmyard, Anna was lifting Sarah down from the chicken coop with gentle care. The little girl threw her arms around Anna's neck in an impulsive hug that spoke of the instant trust children reserved for people they recognized as fundamentally safe. Anna's face transformed with surprised joy, and she returned the embrace with the careful tenderness of someone who'd been starved for such simple human connection. "She's been cleared completely then," Jack said. "No shadow left on her reputation. Clear as mountain spring water. Any employer who checks her background now will find nothing but honest work and sterling character references." Morrison finished his cornbread and wiped his hands on his napkin. "Course. Seems to me she's already found steady employment that suits her abilities." Jack looked around the farmyard at the families gathered on his land for the harvest celebration. Children played elaborate games of tag between the barn and the main house while their parents shared recipes, gossip, and the comfortable complaints of people whose lives revolved around weather and crops and livestock. The scene had the easy rhythm of a community that had accepted a new member without reservation. Anna emerged from the chicken coop with Sarah's hand firmly clasped in hers. They walked toward the gathered families, and Jack noticed how naturally Anna moved among them, now not as an outsider looking in through windows, but as someone who belonged to this place and these people. Mrs. Patterson intercepted them near the food tables and produced another piece of paper from her seemingly endless supply. Anna read whatever message she'd written and responded with a smile that lit up her entire face, not the careful, guarded expression she'd maintained for months, but something open and genuine that spoke of barriers finally lowered. She took Mrs. Patterson's pencil and wrote back, her response apparently so amusing that Mrs. Patterson laughed aloud and showed the paper to Mrs. Clemens, who chuckled and nodded her approval. "What do you reckon she wrote?" Morrison asked, curious about the exchange. Jack watched Anna hand the paper to another woman who read it with obvious delight. Knowing Anna, probably something practical. Recipe for preserving tomatoes. or advice about getting chickens to lay consistently through the winter months. Morrison chuckled and finished his coffee. Practical wisdom. That's exactly what this community needs more of. As the evening light began to fade into purple twilight, families started gathering their belongings and hitching horses to wagons for the ride home. Children protested being loaded into wagon beds, wanting to stay longer and continue playing games that had no clear winners or losers. Adults lingered over final conversations, reluctant to end the gathering that had brought such easy pleasure to the end of a long harvest season. Sarah broke away from her parents one final time and ran back to Anna, her small legs pumping with determination. The child reached Anna and said something with the elaborate hand gestures that children used when words seemed inadequate. Anna nodded solemnly and knelt to accept another fierce hug goodbye. When Sarah's father came to collect her, he touched his hat brim respectfully to Anna and spoke words that were clearly meant as thanks, even though she couldn't hear them. Anna smiled and nodded, understanding his meaning from his expression and the grateful tone that transcended the barrier of sound. One by one, the wagons rolled away into the gathering darkness, their wheels crunching on the gravel drive while lanterns swayed from wagon hooks like moving stars. Anna and Jack stood on the porch, watching the dust settle in the farmyard that had been filled with laughter and conversation just minutes before. The silence that remained felt different from the loneliness Jack had known during his years of working the farm alone. This quiet was full of possibility and contentment, weighted with the satisfaction of work well done and community bonds properly forged. Anna pulled out her paper and pencil and wrote something brief. She handed the note to Jack and waited while he read it by the light of the lamp hanging beside the cabin door. Says she never expected to find a place where people would give her a chance to prove her worth through work rather than words. Jack read aloud. Says she's grateful for the employment, but even more grateful for the trust and acceptance. Anna wrote again. Her message shorter this time. May I stay permanently. This feels like home. Jack looked at her standing in the golden lamplight, her face showing hope tempered by years of disappointment, but no longer dominated by it. Around them, the farm stretched into comfortable darkness, 40 acres of good land that had produced more abundantly with 2 people working it than it ever had with just one. Don't see why not, he said, folding the paper and putting it in his shirt pocket. Partnership's been profitable for both of us, and there's plenty of work ahead with winter preparations and planning for next year's crops. Anna's smile was radiant enough to compete with the lamp flame. She wrote one final note and handed it to him. Thank you for seeing what others couldn't or wouldn't. Jack read the words and understood that they referred to more than just her ability to work despite her deafness. They spoke of dignity recognized, character acknowledged, and potential given room to flourish in soil that had been waiting for the right person to tend it properly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, preparations for winter, maintenance tasks that couldn't be postponed, and the 100 daily responsibilities that kept a farm running successfully through changing seasons. But tonight, for the first time in months, Anna's shoulders carried no tension from uncertainty about the future. She had found what she'd been searching for through towns and jobs and disappointments that had tested but never broken her resolve. A place where her hands could speak louder than words ever could. Where her character mattered more than her limitations. And where she belonged not as charity or convenience, but as an essential part of something larger than herself. A place where she was home. Sometimes the most profound conversations happen without words ever being spoken. In writing Anna and Jack's story, I found myself thinking about all the ways we communicate beyond language through patience, through respect, through the simple act of giving someone a chance when others won't. Their partnership reminds us that understanding doesn't require hearing every word, and that dignity isn't something we grant to others, it's something we recognize in them. Anna's strength wasn't in overcoming her deafness, but in maintaining her character despite a world that often dismissed her before giving her a fair chance. Jack's quiet heroism wasn't in rescuing Anna, but in seeing her worth, when others looked past her. Together, they built something neither could have achieved alone, not just a successful farm, but a bridge between isolation and belonging. In our own communities, we encounter people like Anna every day, people whose differences make others uncomfortable, people who've been judged by appearances rather than actions. The question isn't whether they deserve our acceptance, it's whether we have the wisdom to recognize what they might offer if given the opportunity. True community isn't built on sameness, but on the courage to see value in unexpected places. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the American frontier experience, created solely for entertainment purposes. The narrative does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.